Hello, WiCCD members. My name is Maya Shukeri, and I am WiCCD's Education Committee Director. I'm happy to introduce our series, Finding Your Niche. In this series, we will interview female criminal defense lawyers who practice in a specific area within criminal law. The goal of our series is to highlight the work and accomplishments of female criminal defense lawyers, but it is also a way for us to introduce you to specialty areas within criminal law. We hope we can help you find your niche. Enjoy the series. Caryma Sa'd, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very happy to see you. It's always fun to chat with you, Karima. You're full of surprises and you're always doing something new and original. And I think this is going to be a very interesting chat. I've been looking forward to chatting with you, and it's been a while that I've been wanting to interview you. I know you're very busy. You're very busy as a lawyer, but also as an activist and with all the things that you do outside of the law. And we're going to get into all of that in this interview. But before we start, I always like to ask my guests to introduce themselves. And I know you have a very interesting niche. So I'll let you tell us more about what you do, Karima.
Thank you. So my name is Caryma Sa'd, and I am a 2016 call. A lot of my practice focuses on landlord-tenant matters. I also have a criminal practice and a bit of a niche in cannabis as it relates to housing and criminal law. And so that's where my legal focus has been for the past several years. I represent both tenants and landlords at the Landlord and Tenant Board and Divisional Court, primarily doing evictions, starting or stopping evictions. And of course, there is sometimes overlap between criminal issues and housing. So I work in that intersection, and that's part of my life. And the other part of my life really started, I would say, during the pandemic. I began documenting protests initially in Toronto, and then I broadened my scope to Ontario, focusing on what brings or has brought people out onto the streets. And that started with anti-lockdown, anti-mandate, anti-vaccine type protests. The convoy, I was there for the duration of that. Protests around curriculum for sexual orientation, gender identity, drag story time, and most recently, Israel-Palestine. And I, in addition to being there and recording what's happening on the ground, my footage is often used by media outlets at the local, national, international level, and I get the opportunity to offer commentary about what I see as happening. I don't really consider this to be activism per se, in that I'm there to observe and document what people are doing in reaction to local or global issues, how they are expressing themselves, how that intersects with Canadian law in a criminal sense, a constitutional sense. And I suppose to the extent that there is activism, I'm a big proponent of rule of law and civil liberties. And that weirdly in our times can be controversial. And maybe that's always been the case. I can only speak to the era that I exist in, but there has been a lot of controversy, a lot of polarization, and I dedicate a lot of my free time to trying to understand these different sort of what's happening in our country. And yeah, that's me. I have a pretty strong media presence. And, at times, like throughout my career, I've focused on various issues. I mentioned cannabis at the outset. I was the executive director of Normal Canada for a period of time during the pandemic. I have done a fair bit of work with just expression through different mediums, through vignettes, through publishing comics, like editorial cartoons. I really value freedom of expression and try to exercise it in different ways just to give my take on what's going on. I enjoy that, and I'm sure we'll get more into it, but that's in a nutshell who I am and what I do.
Well, thank you for this introduction, Karima. And obviously, I mean, as we can see, you are very active and you do a lot of things, a lot of various things that are very different. Now, I understand how, as a criminal lawyer, you can get into cannabis law. There is a strong connection there. Landlord and tenant, you did mention that there is some kind of overlap on the criminal side and housing sometimes, but it is not very often that we see that. So how are you able, though, because your landlord-tenant practice is actually very large, like you have a lot of cases in that area of the law. How are you able to manage that with criminal law? Because yes, there is some intersection, but it's not that often that we have criminal and landlord-tenant cases, unless I'm wrong. I don't practice in that area. So I'm just out of curiosity, for someone, for example, who practices primarily in criminal, and let's say who's watching this interview and is interested in developing a niche in landlord-tenant. So how can they get into that as criminal lawyers?
So I fell into the landlord tenant sphere a little bit by accident. It was through a referral, and the case that I took on had a public interest component, was reported on by different media outlets in Toronto. And from there, I started receiving a lot more landlord tenant calls. So I kind of figured out that niche in real time as I was learning to be a lawyer. And it's maybe not the most obvious overlap, but the types of issues I deal with, where there is that kind of two minds. There are times that either a landlord or a tenant seeks a peace bond against the other, or commits a crime, and so there is a no contact or don't be within this distance. There are eviction forms specific to allegations of committing illegal acts. There are, and that kind of with cannabis, sometimes those illegal acts involve growing beyond what is allowed, or growing in a way that is infringing on other people's rights, or and there's like a slight human rights component to this as well. Consuming cannabis where a lease may say no, but the person has medical needs. So those are kind of, and I've started to for a long time have been getting calls from criminal lawyers who are dealing with this housing component. My client is in custody. They're facing now eviction proceedings for non-payment of rent, for example, or for whatever it is that put them in custody. How do we deal with this so that they don't lose their housing while they're in jail? It's that's not an exhaustive list, but you can see through this how, yeah, sometimes the two do mesh together. I will say the bulk of my criminal clients are either landlords or tenants,
Okay.
who have gone astray, if we put it that way, or are facing allegations that they need to respond to. So for me, it's more or less the same pool of individuals, and I'm not kind of taking on random cases, or I don't have a sexual assault practice at all, or a impaired driving practice. Like, I don't deal with those specific niches in criminal law that are very procedurally, they have that's
More
their own beast,
specialized.
right?
Yeah,
Those are their own beast. So
right.
I'm pretty limited in the types of criminal files that I take on. And for the vast majority, it relates to housing. And yeah, that's if someone wants to get into it. I mean, the reason I started with the landlord tenant board was really to develop my advocacy chops. So much of what happens at the board is based on hearing type scenarios, and mediation with the other side, but it's a lot of being on your feet. There's not a ton of motions or non-substantive appearances, right? You're just running with the case that you have, and I really enjoy that. It's also, I find beneficial, in that there is the main piece of legislation, the Residential Tenancies Act, and once you have a good handle on the framework of that legislation, you're really just applying the law to different fact scenarios. And I enjoy that. I like being in hearings. I That's why a lot of people are attracted to criminal law, because it's more litigation than civil litigation, I
Right.
think. And so administrative tribunals, that's even more true, I would say. And if someone's interested to get into that area, it's really a matter of reaching people where they're at, where they need those services or that assistance. So a lot of my practice was built through targeted marketing. And now, I've had to put less of an emphasis on that, because it kind of runs on its own, right?
Yeah.
Through word of mouth, through the groundwork that has already been laid. And I'm very fortunate in that regard.
And so, because you did mention that you fell into landlord and tenant, that area of practice by accident, but like, what did you want to do? Like, did you originally want to become a specific type of lawyer, and then you got into this area and you then realized that, oh, okay, this is good, I'm gonna then focus on that? Or what was your goal originally,
I'm
Karima?
still trying to figure out what I want.
Okay.
So
Okay.
when
Yeah.
it was a mentor, a criminal lawyer mentor actually, who didn't have the time or bandwidth for that particular case. So that's how I got it, through my connections in criminal law. And when I started my practice, I didn't have a clear direction of what exactly I wanted to do.
You
I
started in
knew,
criminal though, right?
yeah, I would
Okay.
say, I mean, I started really with attending random court proceedings, and just, is this getting the lay of the land? Is this something I could see myself doing? So I articled in more of a civil litigation. It was a civil litigation boutique on Bay Street. So I knew from that kind of what I liked, what I didn't like. I didn't really picture myself doing civil cases, because a lot of it is not being in court. And I didn't really want to do family law, because I'd heard so many horror stories of
Yeah.
what that particular practice is like. So that left criminal if I wanted to be in court. I guess there are other options as well, but in my mind at the time, I'm like, okay, I'm going to spend some time hanging out in criminal court. This is pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
So I would literally just go to the courtroom. And this is while I was on EI following my articles, and I had this a few month buffer of figure your life out, Karima. So I spent that time in court talking to lawyers, observing them. I hadn't really taken criminal law courses beyond what was mandatory in law school. I didn't envision myself in that sphere, but turns out it's a really great bar. Like the defense bar is amazing and supportive, and people were just open to having conversations and giving suggestions. And I really appreciated the fact as well that, you know, you're working with people on real life problems, and being able to assist at the stage where someone is dealing with criminal charges, especially if it's not someone who is, let's say, entrapped in the system and constantly dealing with it, but you know, this is an anomaly for them, and the way that it's handled can have significant impact on what their life looks like going forward. So that was appealing to me, and you know, that's also all true of housing law. Um, you're dealing with people where it's at a juncture, and how things play out will affect, you know, their future prospects or opportunities, or you know, whether they have shelter. And so the stakes are pretty high. I yeah, that's I don't know if that answers the question, in part because I forget. I rambled a little bit there, but that's kind of what I find appealing about it, and what attracted me to it. It wasn't a deliberate, I set out to do this. At the time that I began my practice, I had a few human rights files, a few, you know, just trying out different things to see what worked best. I knew for sure that it wasn't sustainable to constantly be dealing with all types of different tribunals. I wanted to have one area that I clearly understood, that I could set myself apart from others, formulate a niche, and it just worked out that for me it was housing law.
Well, and you are successful in creating this niche because, I mean, I certainly know, like, whenever I have clients who ask me about, you know, landlord tenant issues, I immediately think about you. So even though I'm based in the East region, I'll give your name. So you are really very successful in creating your own niche in your practice, and you have a very unique style. And so that's working really well for you. So whether it was intentional or not, it's your marketing strategy is definitely working. And what is also adding, of course, is that you're very, as you mentioned, you're very present on social media. You have a strong presence. You're also on various media outlets. People reach out for you and they ask you for interviews. So let's talk a little bit about that as well. And I know now you said that you have developed an interest in knowing what gets people to get on the streets, but did that originally start by accident as well? Or is it something that you decided one day, okay, you know what, I want to start, you know, going on the streets and seeing what's happening? Like, tell us about how this started, and let's then talk about the evolution of this, because it's becoming a career. You're doing this for free though, right? Like these, or
Yes, mostly.
okay.
There are opportunities, and like crowdfunding has been a way to support, or at least subsidize, the out-of-pocket expense, especially when traveling from one city to the
Right.
next. And I'm working more on developing kind of the media aspect of what I do, because I'm just, here I am stumbling from one mistake to the next, or one accident to the next,
Yeah.
and turning lemons into lemonade. And that's very much the case for my protest coverage as well. Where my office is situated, downtown Toronto, during the height of lockdowns, there were weekly parades. And I, you know, noticed from my window that these parades, there's police involved, everyone else is inside, these guys are out. They have signs, you know, it's it's hard thinking back at that time, because you know, we've resettled into a new kind of normal, right? But
Right.
at the time it was, whoa, that's a lot of people gathered together, and we're not supposed to be doing that. What's going
Yeah.
on? So after a few weeks of kind of seeing this happening outside my doorstep, yeah, I went downstairs and like, what's up, what's happening? And that started with just taking pictures of signs, and I wasn't really doing it to document it. And at the same time, the media, like mainstream media, really wasn't covering this.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few one-off events, but the protesters were a little bit hostile to journalists as well. And so I had this advantage of kind of being there in plain clothes. I'm using a cell phone. I don't have fancy equipment. I'm not known as a journalist. And so I was able to be a fly on the wall at these events. And, I wasn't publishing this footage with any particular intent when I started. It was just sharing it on my social media page, but people were interested, as I wasn't the only one that was curious. And I happened to be situated um, in various respects, that I was able to go investigate. And then, after a few months of this, patterns emerge. I become more curious, like there's more questions than I have answers. And so that's how kind of it evolved, and evolved to where today, like it's a big part of what I do. And that certainly was not intentional. Um, it does feel in some ways a bit vocational. So.
Now, as you were covering what was going on, because I know you mentioned that it was first out of curiosity because you saw that there were people on the street, so you were just curious to see what was going on. And obviously, I mean, they were protesting against something. And so, but I mean, you probably have your own personal views about things, or you were, making your observations and developing your own views. But do you express your views through the footage that you
Mhm.
do, or is it, or what you're trying to do is just to take the information that's out there and provide it to the public and let them decide? Like, how are you doing this?
I think when I started, I was a little bit more heavy-handed with my commentary, and trying to analyze at the same time that I was observing. And that approach gradually shifted, as I realized, first of all, that there were other people doing similar things, who were very clearly for one side or the other side, to the extent that there are sides. And we didn't need more of that, because what was lacking, I think, in the landscape was the ability for people to take in raw information and come to their own conclusions. And we are in an information overload, I would say. So I'm mindful that kind of offering a bit of guidance to people on, you know, interpreting what they see, that's not inherently a bad thing. And so my approach today is really where the same video will often elicit totally opposite reactions, depending on, the perspective through which someone sees it. I find that fascinating. I keep my comment sections as open as possible, which, there's something to be said about it providing sort of a space for people whose views, well, this is kind of deplorable. How can you allow this on your page? It's what it is, right? This is just what it is. And so that's my attitude, that I take right now. I'm just showing, whether, that's acting as a mirror or a window, right? Depending on, like, the metaphor will change, depending on what it is I'm showing. And of course, like, there's editorial choices made, as far as language, as far as the length of a particular clip, right? You can have an hour's worth of footage, and if you're starting at different points, it will tell a different story. So that's just an inherent part of expressing information and making it public. But I do try and do that in a way that is fair, and not specifically, there's no real agenda here. And there are times that my personal view on a particular cause, which I now take care to not really express. In my personal life, that's different, but publicly, my focus is really honed in on, yes, I will share opinions on the tactics being used, or how people are behaving, but I try not to get caught up in the underlying cause, because there's already so many people who are sharing their opinions. Mine, one way or the other, isn't going to, it's not going to tip the scale. And I think it compromises a little bit the validity of kind of what I'm looking to do, which is focus on the Canadian reaction to all of these different issues. So I sometimes personally will feel one way about something, and then I'm in the position of, unfortunately, the people who are representing this cause are doing it a disservice. And I think that there is validity in showing that as well. And it requires a certain level of stomach. And you know, I get very strong reactions from people who feel a way or another about the coverage. Lots of shooting the messenger, lots of, well, why did you say it like this? Why didn't you say it like that? You know, these are the words you should be using, not those words. And I tune out a lot of that noise. There is a real art in distinguishing between signal and noise. And, you know, that is something that I learn on an ongoing basis. I wasn't specifically trained for this work, although I do find that a lot of the skills, you know, I obtained through my undergrad and law school and master's course, like they're transferable. But I do a lot of learning on the fly because this is new to me as well. And in fact, I think all of us are in relatively uncharted territory. So there are playbooks, but nothing that is specific or perfectly adaptable to our circumstances. So I am comfortable exploring as I go. It's never going to be perfect. There will inevitably be things that could have been done differently or better, or mistakes. And like I'm my own biggest critic, as much as other people are awful critics, or very harsh critics. No one's going to be meaner to me than myself. So that's my training right there. And yeah, that's the attitude.
Well, that's a very good attitude, but there's also a lot to unpack here in what you said, because what's interesting, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of people watch what you post and are interested in it is because it's been a few years now. I think the general impression of the public is that there is information out there, but not everybody is covering it. And so people aren't getting the whole picture of what's really going on. So there's like and regular media that usually cover one side, and there are other things happening and people don't have access to that. And because you travel and you go and you follow the information, so you have the ability to actually give additional footage about things that are not necessarily covered. And I think there's this craving right now in society. People want to know, they feel like they're not getting all the information that's out there, and you can't really make a good decision if you don't know all the facts. So I think that's one of the reasons why people enjoy watching, whether they enjoy it or they dislike it, but
They're
they still want to
compelled,
know.
yes.
Still want to know. But it's, I mean, it is also still risky because some people will in a way, it's similar to what we do as criminal defense lawyers, is that when you're representing someone, they tend to associate you with the person that you're representing, that you for sure approve the acts, you condone the acts, and you think the same way as your client. So I think a lot of people also will necessarily assume that, well, if you're, let's say, in a protest about something and you're covering something, it's you must be pro this or depending. So tell us a bit more about that, because you made it clear that you try not to express your views now, like you're really trying to dissociate, you're just trying to be a neutral information provider or observer. But tell us, how do you deal with these situations, Karima?
Absolutely, I'm constantly being conflated with where I am, who I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
to. There is a lot less tolerance, I think, for hearing diverging viewpoints.
Yeah.
And I find that to be frustrating and counterproductive at times, because being able to entertain someone's ideas or hear them out is not the same as accepting them. And like sharing that conversation or discussion is not equivalent to an endorsement. And that distinction is not widely understood or accepted. And people will try and use me as a punching bag because they feel a certain way about what they're seeing play out on screen, as if I am the puppet master behind all of it. I'm actually trying to understand who the puppet masters are,
Well,
because
actually, on this point, are there people who tell you sometimes to go to places and to film particular things, or is it all you, your initiative? You decide what you want to do?
yeah, I'm fully independent in
Mm-hmm.
the sense that I choose where to go and when, and
What to
there.
cover?
Yeah, exactly. I will get tips, or through perusing what's publicly available, will realize that okay, this might be a good event. So I that's my information gathering resource. And like I don't, as some people who have donated to me, or offered support for the coverage, have come to realize, that doesn't come with any level of editorial control. And I've had people feel slighted because, oh, I gave her $20 and now she's saying this, and it's like, yes, but you didn't purchase like any control over my observations or my thoughts. And it really is like there's no strings attached from my perspective. So if people are expecting there to be strings, they're disappointed. And like maybe this is a whole other conversation. But the idea of parasocial relationships, of fan culture, of anti-fan culture, those are all, like, I guess, sociological phenomena that I didn't account for when I started doing this, and are very real. Like people who feel that they have invested, whether it's time or energy or resources, and it is a one-sided relationship, or one that is amicable, but it's not equivalent to a partnership in any sense of the word. Yet they will feel very strongly when their expectations, which were always unilateral, aren't met.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I've had to navigate as well, including from people who I might other like have respected or had a good dealing with, and it it's too bad that that's the way people think, but I try to resist that. Um, and I mentioned at the outset, most of my criminal work is related to landlord tenant stuff, or like landlords and tenants. There's also now like a little practice I have that relates to protesters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, that's a function of often being the only lawyer who people know or have interacted with. So I get a lot of kind of requests
Exposure. Yeah,
coming
but you're
because of,
certainly being exposed a
yeah,
lot when you go to all these places and you talk, and because you interact with people, you do
yeah,
sometimes interview people, you ask
yeah.
them. for things so people get to know you. So I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people in the public who know you or who have heard of you. So it is actually a very good way also to gain clients and to, whether it's intentional or not, but I mean, it is helping your career. But I do want to get on to the other aspect, that it helps your career in this way, that you can build a client base, but can it also affect your career? Like, can it also kill it in a different way, especially because you are covering controversial issues? It's not like you're covering something that everybody likes. I don't know, like a flower festival, or, like it's a really very like, especially, I mean, let's just talk here about the elephant in the room. The biggest issue right now, controversial issue, is the Israel-Palestine war. And so a lot of people have very strong views, and it's not a recent issue like the convoy, the truckers. This is a more recent issue, but Palestine, Israel has been around for a long, long time now, for decades. And it is very controversial. I mean, even in the criminal law practice, we have very strong views that we see exposed on social media. But you're actually also going to some of these protests and you're covering that. So, but isn't that, like, for a lot of people, this is a very risky move to be there and to actively show yourself in these protests. So maybe if you can tell us how you're dealing with that particular type of situation.
Yeah, this is not for everyone. And like, I'll just say that at the outset. And that's not like a judgment of any sort. It's just, it depends on one's own disposition, right? Like, what level of hatred, frankly, from
Yeah.
strangers are you willing to absorb? What level of harassment are you equipped to follow up through formal legal channels where it crosses a line? That's a huge energy suck. And yes, it takes a significant toll. So it's not for everyone, and that's okay. I've said this elsewhere, and it's even evident from the shirt I'm wearing right now. Huge wrestling fan. So for me, I see a lot of parallels between the protest circuit and professional wrestling. And I enjoy professional wrestling and I enjoy attending these protests. So if I didn't enjoy this, it wouldn't be sustainable or feasible. So that's why I'm able to do this and why I'm able to absorb, like, take some of these risks. And it's maybe foolhardy. And maybe, in 10 years, I look back and this was all a terrible decision. But I don't feel that way right now. And I feel actually that I am fulfilling a purpose that will be useful for, like, in a broader sense in the future. So that's where I take, my, like, reassurance, if we put it that way, or like I run with it because I think it matters. And like Israel Palestine in particular, my father's Palestinian, my videographer is Jewish. We have both been called traitors to the cause. From people who don't know us, don't know what we think, how we think, and it get a lot of almost preemptive hatred, because, oh, well, I've seen them post this, so that must mean that. And, let's go attack, or let's go chase them out or intimidate them out. I'm like at the center of some pretty serious harassment campaigns. And, there are pending police investigations as a result of that. Like, this is the first time I've had to be a complainant about anything, like, in the course of this journalistic coverage. So I am seeing a different side of the criminal justice system as a result. Criminal justice, whatever. You know what I mean. So yeah, that and I think that we are in an age of snap judgment, and mental shortcuts. And like, the same things that affect us as defense lawyers, or rather affect our clients, right? Primacy bias, confirmation bias, various forms of prejudice. I am experiencing those firsthand. And yes, it can close doors, if we put it that way. I've had people, you know, ranging from unfollowing me on social media, which is ultimately insignificant, who cares, to actively filing law society complaints against me for just my expression or the way that I am conducting myself, to, you know, actively, like, there's a pretty broad spectrum of ways that people will try and make me pay or suffer for what I'm doing. And that's like attacking my livelihood, like threats, attacking people around me. So that's all very real. And yeah, I guess I've covered kind of why I do it anyway. And I'm a Taurus, so like that stubbornness is in my nature. And I don't know. This might be crazy.
But do you think that there is hope that things could change? And especially that if there are more and more people who do the type of work that you're doing, do you have hope that people's opinions can change? I know we're living in a very bizarre time right now where people have very strong views. It's very difficult to negotiate with people who have their own ideologies. But do you feel like there could be a shift sometime soon, that there are some people who are getting more and more open? Or do you think it's just getting from bad to worse?
I interact all the time with people who say, you know, I don't agree with everything that you post, but I'm glad that you're doing it. You know, you've made me think differently about certain things. You've confirmed my feelings about other things. It challenges me, and I appreciate that. And like that is like the you can't rely on external validation to be a motivator for anything because it's so fickle. But I will say that that gives me the courage and resolve to keep going. Because I think that being able to pierce echo chambers, and that's if we take a step back and like, what is my work really about? I do try and pierce echo chambers, and I put people who are, you know, on opposite sides into the same reply section. And you know, it's a war zone out there sometimes, right? Like I barely read the comments because it's just I can't be. It would be the major time suck, right? I don't really engage substantively. I just put it out there, and then people can react. And I'm learning to be less sort of involved or defensive about it and just let it unfold as it will. But I think the only way that we do get through this and make it on the other side is if there is dialogue and conversation and people recognizing each other's humanity. If there is sort of, yeah, like that's what's lacking. And there's not always humanity again in the reply section. But then there's people who call that out, and I find that that's we're all here, right? We're all here, kind of in the same cohort of human history. We can't change who our neighbors are. We can only try and work on our ability to get along with one another, and what are the structures, like the societal institutional structures, how are those going to operate so that everyone can coexist, right, um, without fear for safety, with maximizing everyone's civil liberties, you know, without terrorizing one another. And yeah, so I against all odds, remain optimistic about that. And I think that people who are, you know, let's say in my case, I'm a visible minority, and a woman, and I've had to walk this skin my entire life. And in the legal industry, for example, like there can be, it's an unfamiliar territory. It's one where it's not a given that you're going to be accepted or able to sort of, like, there are obstacles and challenges, and you must find ways to get along with opposing, whether it's the crown or the
Especially for
judges, or
women in this
yeah,
profession.
right. So it can be a hostile territory.
It
And
is.
yeah,
It's not, it can be, it is
yeah, no,
hostile.
that's yes. And in order to like make it work, you inevitably are dealing with people who may not like you for who you are,
Yeah.
might want to sabotage you for who you are. But like, is it possible to overcome that? Yes. And so I like, that's what's true in that kind of microcosm is true on a broader societal scale. And I think that there are some very concerning trends, domestically and internationally, where if we don't reassert the importance of rule of law, of separation of powers, if we don't call out corruption where it's happening, with advancements in technology, with kind of it's precarious. Like this, the crackdown on protesters, for example. I think that is overall bad for everyone.
Yeah.
And in the patterns that I'm observing, like police are involved, politicians are involved, mainstream media is involved, in crafting certain narratives and getting certain things done, and it's not always above board. So it's crucial, I believe, to bear witness and to do what I can in my small, limited capacity, to document and share this information. And then what happens beyond that, I can't control. I can only control what I'm putting out there, and that's how I get through sort of the dark parts, the dark thoughts involved, because it is a bleak landscape that we're dealing with, very bleak.
Right. And Karima, were you able to use any of the observations that you made in your practice as a lawyer? Like, do you find that this, in addition to, what you've learned about society and how people think and what's going on in the world right now, but do you feel like this is also useful information that you can use and incorporate into your practice as a lawyer, whether it's a criminal defense lawyer or a landlord tenant lawyer? Has that also been useful for your work as a lawyer?
Yeah, it's complementary, because as a lawyer, you consult with people from all walks of life, and like it just exposes you to a side of the real world,
Yeah.
especially in housing and criminal law. Like, it's just something I might otherwise have been relatively sheltered from. And then being on the ground at these protests is the same. And a lot of like, it's people get out there, to find community, but also to express grievances. And these grievances aren't all imaginary. In fact, most are very, very real. So I find that it makes me more empathetic, um, and like, so that's beneficial as a lawyer.
Yeah.
I also find that, and this is maybe a bit contradictory, but it makes me a bit more jaded in other respects, and that helps me as a lawyer. So yeah, all the life experiences we have are transferable in one way or another to practice, and this is no exception.
Right. And I mean, as defense lawyers, one advantage that we have over other justice system participants is that we have this direct connection with clients and with real life people, and we get to see their stories and what they go through. But obviously in your case, it's expanded because you also get to talk to more people from the general public and to see directly what's going on with them. So that's definitely, like a big bonus that you have here. One last thing that I wanted to ask you, Karima, how do you have the time to do all this? Because I mean, we know that practicing law is very time consuming, and you do have very busy practice. I mean, I know that you also have a few cases. I've seen you in courts in Ottawa, so you are a busy lawyer, and you're very active still on social media, and you're covering all these protests, and there are a lot of protests at the moment. So how do you balance, and how do you find the time to do both?
I'm constantly trying to improve my time management,
Okay.
and part of that involves delegating.
Mhm.
Part of that involves saying no to things. I do have a practice that is fairly streamlined because it's majority landlord tenant, and I'm focusing on specific issues, specific eviction issues, whether for the landlord or the tenant. But we're relying on the same provisions of the act. I'm learning from each case that I do, kind of this worked, this didn't work, and so I'm building my own little institutional bank of knowledge. And I have increased my prices to kind of ensure that I'm taking on cases and clients where I can dedicate my time. Like I've reduced volume
Mhm.
basically, in exchange for that. And I'm that's how do any of us make anything work? I don't have kids, and I don't have sort of other obligations or things outside of this. So there are sacrifices made in that respect. And it's really just kind of in the buffet of life. I'm picking what's on my plate, and this is my plate.
All right. Well, you're doing a lot of work though, and we're all like following what you're doing, and you're certainly opening our eyes to a lot of things that are happening in the world. And thank you so much for that, Karima. And thank you for taking the time today to share what you do with me in this interview. It's always nice to chat with you, but it was really nice to get to talk more about what you do, as opposed to just watching it, like you're sharing with us exactly how you're doing it. So I wish you honestly the best of luck, and hopefully we'll talk again soon. We'll have another interview where we can get to talk about more about, I don't know, maybe you'll start doing something else. You're always surprising us with something new. So I wouldn't be surprised if you start doing something completely different in the future, and I will be more than happy to interview you again, whether it's about this or any other specific event that you're covering that is of interest. So thank you, Karima.
Thank you so much, and keep it up with these series. I love them. I love watching just people, lawyers in different kind of areas, but within the same umbrella. I always learn a lot, and I hope that this episode is useful for someone else. Thank you.
I'm sure it is. And thank you for watching.